Hello, everyone. I'm Farwa Aamer, and I'm the Director of South Asia Initiatives at the Asia Society Policy Institute in New York. Today, we dive into a significant topic elections. Amidst this momentous election year, it's impossible not to spotlight India's ongoing, nearly 6 week long election process. With close to 970 million eligible voters, this election stands as the world's largest democratic exercise, a pivotal event shaping India's trajectory for the coming years, with Prime Minister Modi's victory widely anticipated. Yet, what implications does this hold for India's relations with its southern and southeastern neighbors? To explore this question, I'm delighted to be in conversation with Dr. Natalie Sambhi, Senior Fellow at the Asia Society Policy Institute, Australia. Welcome, Natalie.
Thanks very much, Farwa. It's been interesting, actually. We've been thinking a lot about what is happening with the elections in what is one of the Indo-Pacific's most consequential nations. So when we think about it, looking at not just from Canberra, but from many of the capitals in Southeast Asia, such a state, who's going to lead it? Where is it going to go? What does that mean, not just for the Indo-Pacific, but for the globe? I think is certainly something in the forefront of our minds. I thought, well, if that's the case, let's look at not just India's influence in the Indo-Pacific. Let's start with South Asia. So with you, Farwa, what do you think? How do you perceive India's current relationship with South Asia? What are the key factors that drive India's strategy in that region? And how do you think a potential third term for Prime Minister Modi might alter those dynamics?
Certainly, India's current relationship with South Asia is complex. It's characterized by a mix of cooperation and historical tensions rooted in the region's legacy. The concept of Indian primacy and the idea of its leadership in the region has sometimes led to strained relations with neighboring countries that may not fully embrace those notions. In past years, India's neighborhood policies have also often been influenced by domestic developments in neighboring countries. Particularly, we've seen that in the case of Sri Lanka and Nepal, and have often not taken the kind of positive turn for India as it would have wanted. Then you have persistent political challenges with the likes of Pakistan in the neighborhood, which have significantly impacted regional frameworks like the South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation, or SARC, stalling multilateral initiatives in the region. Under Prime Minister Modi's tenure, initiatives such as the BIMSTEC and BBIN have been pursued on a regional level, but have faced challenges in achieving comprehensive success, which somewhat highlights the absence of a cohesive South Asia policy coming from India. Instead, we've seen that bilateral and trilateral engagements have been prioritized, particularly focusing on energy trade and socioeconomic collaborations. Another critical perspective shaping India's approach to the region is China's expanding influence, notably through initiatives like the Belt and Road Initiative, or the BRI, which has provided an economic alternative for South Asian nations. So now there is an additional China factor to how India looks at the neighborhood and policies it may undertake to counterbalance sort of China's growing weight in the region. So looking ahead now, a potential third term for Prime Minister Modi could entail a continuation of these diplomatic efforts, and we can talk a little bit more about it later, with a heightened focus on advancing India's strategic interests in the region. It also be intertwined with India's domestic politics. I have to say, 2024 has been an important year overall for the region, with pivotal elections in Bangladesh, in Bhutan, in Pakistan, and Sri Lanka coming up in the fall. So the space is evolving in many ways, and it'll be interesting to see how all these political transitions will impact the internal dynamics and India's engagement. But that is for South Asia, Natalie. If I can just ask you the same, in what ways has Prime Minister Modi's leadership impacted India's diplomatic and economic ties with ASEAN countries? And what are the key challenges and opportunities India may face in advancing its interests and influence in Southeast Asia under Prime Minister Modi's continued leadership?
I mean, as you know, India has been such an important country to Southeast Asia. There are so many countries that border India and countries where the religious and other sort of influences still play out today. But I think under Modi, Southeast Asia has been a real beneficiary of a step up of the Look East policy. Under the Act East policy, I saw Prime Minister Modi reach out to many more Southeast Asian nations. In particular, this year, Indonesia and India are celebrating 75 years of diplomatic ties. And in 2018, Prime Minister Modi and President Joko Widodo in Indonesia. They signed the shared vision of India-Indonesia maritime cooperation in the Indo-Pacific, which was huge. If I'm not mistaken, that was the first time a bilateral agreement like that, an MOU, had the word Indo-Pacific in it. And so there was a real potential there for India and Southeast Asia ties to grow, certainly because, as you mentioned, Southeast Asian nations are looking for sources of investment. China provided sources of investment, but also they're looking to different alternatives. So there were many opportunities there for India to invest. And there are certainly opportunities for India to deepen cooperation in the security domain as well. I think there's been a lot of step up of India's involvement in naval exercises, for instance, particularly with Indonesia, as we saw last year, with the Philippines, in helping to balance some of China's influence in the South China Sea. So certainly from an economic, diplomatic and security perspective, India represents a lot of hope and opportunity, particularly under Prime Minister Modi. But I think there are still a number of challenges. So despite the promise of India providing this alternative source of influence or resources, when we look at the latest results from the EAS survey of Southeast Asia, 2024 report that was released just a few weeks ago, when we look at all of ASEAN's dialogue partners, India only ranks 9 out of 11. So I'd be interested to understand, despite this potential, despite these opportunities, why is the perception of India still lagging amongst certain Southeast Asia capitals, how that might change in the next 5 years? So I think there's more room to grow. And another issue I might like to flag as well is that there might be some sensitivities about the treatment of Muslim communities within India, particularly amongst Muslim majority countries such as Indonesia, Malaysia, and Brunei. So while that hasn't caused any type of diplomatic tension thus far, it is something where some of the diplomatic sort of relationship can be determined by domestic drivers. So domestic things that are happening in India may then be taken up by domestic communities in Southeast Asia. So again, complex relationships there, but I think there's just such a positive trajectory if Prime Minister Modi can really take advantage of that. There's only room to grow for India and Southeast Asia as well. But look, I mean, the other element that I think that draws India and Southeast Asia together is this shared history, particularly in terms of this post-colonial spirit. And as you know very well, India and some of the countries in Southeast Asia, particularly Indonesia, were the founders of the non-aligned movement, as something that they share. Can we drill a little bit more down in the legacies of the non-aligned movement in what we see today as the Global South? What are your thoughts on that?
No, just mention of Global South, right? It's diving into that concept, which might be a bit confusing as a terminology because it's just not geography, but represents a significant portion of the world's population. India views itself as a prominent voice within this framework, as reflected in Prime Minister Modi's party manifesto and recent initiatives. And last year, after the successful G20 summit in New Delhi, India hosted a virtual Voice of the Global South Summit. However, China was absent from it, and the Global South has also become sort of like a friction point between these major regional players. But of course, India continues to show its efforts to influence discussions and actions among these important group of nations. And you just also pointed out, there is a room to grow, there's an opportunity to grow, and if India should leverage it under Prime Minister Modi's third term. So with that in mind, Natalie, what are your thoughts? I would love to get your perspective on this also, the whole Global South leadership. How are countries in Southeast Asia, Indonesia in particular, responding to India's leadership role here?
Look, I think Jakarta would see India's role as very important. Let me put it in these terms. Countries in Southeast Asia want to work with the prevailing international order, but I think they would want greater representation within many of the world's major multilateral fora. So, for instance, I think there was a lot of support for the fact that under Japan's leadership of the G7, countries like India and Indonesia were invited to have an observer status. And so if we look at the representation of Southeast Asia and South Asian states and things like the OECD, G20, it's still growing. And so having greater space for developing countries, having their interests put on a global agenda, particularly in areas like climate change, as countries move towards a decarbonization, moving towards renewable energies. how those expenses are borne out more severely for developing nations is something that needs to be reminded, it needs to be taken into account amongst industrialized countries when setting targets, for instance. So having a major developing nation such as India pushing those issues on those global agendas is critical, particularly for countries like Indonesia, for the Philippines, Vietnam, Thailand, where we're seeing rapid economic growth. Making sure that they're taken along on that journey. They have a voice alongside India's. I think that's very, very important. And so we'll see how that goes. I mean, I think even India's leadership in supporting countries like the Philippines in international security and regional security, again, super, super important. So there's a lot, I think, again, to return to that theme of growth and hope, there's a lot there that India can play in terms of representing the interests of what we would consider the global South. But look, coming back to a little bit to Southeast Asia, let's look a little bit more to the future. Farwa, can you please help me understand, what do we foresee as Modi's influence? What will he be able to achieve in India's regional approach, particularly with South Asia?
Sure. And, I agree with everything you said on the global South perspective as well. There is definitely a lot more room to grow and for Prime Minister Modi to step up on the whole idea of being the voice and the leadership role that it carries in the global South. For South Asia, when you're looking ahead, I think the broad contours of India's regional approach may see continuity under a potential third term from Prime Minister Modi. But specific policies and engagements could evolve in response to changing regional dynamics and geopolitical realities. And we're seeing the world is really evolving around us. And there are a lot of different areas where there are divergences, there are opportunities for convergence, and obviously we want to be able to focus on what brings the region together. We could hope to see a more regional outlook coming from India in terms of advancing regional economic stability, working with its neighbors on shared challenges like climate change you were earlier talking about, on renewable energy transition towards a sustainable future. But it'll likely continue to have a more bilateral approach than a cohesive, all-inclusive South Asia approach that we would very much like to see, or at least hope for it to be advanced. How about the Southeast Asian perspective on this? What is the future outlook on a third term? Will there be continuity, do you think?
Look, I think so. You mentioned economic stability there. I mean, again, if we look at the survey of what elites in Southeast Asia are concerned with, it really is about economic growth, stability, providing digital transformation, connectivity. So if India can continue in investing in those elements, I mean, that's part of the agreement that arose out of the ASEAN-India summit that was held last year, that India would help support some of these elements, digital transformation, climate change resilience. If we can see continuity in those areas, I think that will be good in terms of strengthening the relationship between India and Southeast Asia. And potentially, as you said, if India can have a more regional approach, we may even see strengthening between South Asia and Southeast Asia as well. So again, I think we would look to India to help provide that kind of stability, peacefulness in the Indo-Pacific that many of the states in Southeast Asia would want. Many of them would also want India continue playing a role in terms of sourcing defense capability, again, playing that important security role. So I think there's lots to do. Again, in terms of change, we'll wait and see. There's a lot of leadership turnover in Southeast Asia. So I don't expect necessarily much change in the policies of Southeast Asia towards India. But of course, it remains to be seen what President Prabowo will do in Indonesia, what President Bongbong Marcos in the Philippines will need, and of course, a new incoming Prime Minister in Singapore. So again, some unknowns there, but I largely expect a lot of continuity and a lot of positive outcomes in that regard.
Well, on that very optimistic note, thank you so much for tuning in, everyone. And thank you, Natalie, for joining. This was our quick take on one of the facets of the Indian elections, but stay tuned for more and follow the Asia Society Policy Institute's election website hub, the ballot box for all key election insights and analysis. Thank you once again.